Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Sounds like it. Great. Welcome, thank you for coming, for a lot of us in the room. I'm Ray Gauss, Digital Asset Management Architect at Alfresco, where I have product management and software engineering duties around rich media in the product. What's metadata, really? I'll get into this subject a little bit. We've heard that this phrase that metadata is data about data. It's a little tired. It's overused. Metadata can be very powerful. I would be made fun of for calling it awesome by some of my fellow engineers. Us Americans like to say things are awesome. But it's incredibly powerful, and I want to remind us about just how important some of it is and the ways in which we can use different metadata. And metadata is not new. These concepts are nothing Alfresco invented. Metadata has been around for quite a long time in a variety of forms. But of course, Alfresco does strive to make it easy for people to deal with metadata, to incorporate it into your workflows, to help you get your job done. So we're going to take a brief look at metadata in general. We'll take a look at what's been added in 4.2. And we'll get a sneak peek at some of the stuff that's being worked on. I promise you, this won't be too bad. Hopefully, be informative, a little bit of a refresher about some of the different types and contexts that metadata can provide. And that's the context of this talk, setting that up, and pairs well with metadata in general. So we've got a lot of different types of metadata. I tend to put these things in 3 different categories: intrinsic or physical metadata, informational metadata about the content itself, not necessarily the file, and I put rights metadata in its own special little category. It's a very special beast. So to get into each of those a little bit more, our intrinsic or physical metadata is about, again, the file instance, a particular manifestation of our abstract of the content. So that's going to get us things like the file size, the creation date, modification date, who created it, when it was modified, and by who. Those file system properties, essentially. And that stuff has been around quite a while. You see here, this is a DOS 1.0 screenshot. We've had it since then, and long before that, we'll see. And of course, we're all very familiar with this kind of metadata. It's in pretty much every operating system's file info panel. We're going to get that kind of information about modification date, creator, all that good stuff. Other instances of this intrinsic or physical metadata, again, we're talking about a particular manifestation, would include things like resolution or dimensions. In images and videos, you might have color space that was used or color profile that was used. Video and audio are going to have things like codecs that it was encoded in, the method of compression used. And along with that, a bit rate that was used, sort of the quality of the data. And of course, for documents, we can have things like a page count. And our informational metadata, now we're describing, again, the abstract of the content, what that content's about, not the particular file instance. We're not concerned with it at all. So there we've got things like the name and title. Now, not the file name, but the name of the abstract of the content itself. We've got things like the description or the caption. Those are sometimes interchanged in certain metadata standards. We have things like the creator and author. Again, nothing to do with who saved the file. We're talking about who, for a photograph, actually shot this. And so this informational metadata applies to all these different instances. If we printed out a digital image that a photographer shot, all of this would be exactly the same. And we're starting to get used to more of that informational metadata as well. Here we've got a shot of the info panel of Apple's preview, which is used for images and PDFs. And we've got title, author, subject in there. And we see a lot of similar things in other operating systems, even in built-in file info panels in the file system. You can start to see some of this informational metadata at work. And for that to happen, we need to use standards for the metadata itself. It's the only way that all these different clients and systems are going to be able to understand and convey to you what that piece of informational metadata is. So going back to our example here, we've got title, author, subject, Who can tell me what standard this is from? Anybody? What was that? Exactly, Dublin Core. Correct. And I'm sure we've heard the term or the phrase that the good thing about standards is that there are so many of them, and this is just a very tiny glimpse of some of the things that are often brought up in the digital asset management world. And there's a very cool infographic called Seeing Standards that was done by a university researcher who pulls together all these different categories of all these different metadata standards and puts it in this big visualization, which is really cool. Unfortunately, the licensing prohibits me from actually including it here for you all to see, but you can download the slides, which I neglected to mention at the beginning, are available. And click on that link, Seeing Standards, very cool infographic. Interestingly, it does not include a lot of the stuff that's on here, like IPTC. There are other places we start to see more use of this informational metadata. We're starting to get used to this stuff. This is a file info from Adobe Photoshop. I don't expect anybody to see it. That's part of the point, is that there are so many standards across the top here that I can't display it on screen. We've got geospatial data, we've got ID3 for audio, we have DICOM for medical images. It's becoming more and more commonplace to see this kind of stuff in addition to your standard intrinsic or physical metadata. And then our very special friend, our rights metadata. And this is usually concerned with, in most organizations, where did I get this piece of content from? How was it licensed? Where did I get it from? And am I allowed to actually use this in whatever project it is that I'm working on? If I'm doing a mobile app now and maybe we previously purchased online rights, did I actually acquire those rights? Do I have to acquire them again? And if so, how much is that actually going to cost me? It might be prohibitively expensive for me to do a second edition of a book if it's going to cost me just as much or more to relicense all that stuff. And that stuff can get very sticky very quick, but there are some ways of dealing with it. There's lots of rights expression languages out there. I shouldn't say lots of them, but there are several of them out there. Some of them include MPEG 21, ODRL, Open Digital Rights Language, which is a very open and flexible framework that allows you to really nail down just about any rights and licensing expression out there. But with that openness and flexibility comes a bit of confusion for users that are just investigating that standard, because you're choosing your own namespace for your vocabulary. You're choosing sometimes the additional actions that you can add on top of that. So it can be a little intimidating because you're starting kind of from scratch with a couple of tools, a screwdriver and a hammer, and you just need to build something quickly with some licensing expressions. So on the other end of that spectrum would be something like the Picture Licensing Universal System that's gone out and tried to detail every single possible licensing scenarios common for a specific narrowed down content type and narrowed down content uses, that being photography and in general the photography industry and its related industries around marketing, publishing, education, manufacturing, that sort of thing. So it goes through and tries to detail and pick out for you those vocabularies that it thinks you're going to need. And it even includes some packs, sort of bundles of rights that allow you to say, I just want to select from these 10 options. I don't really care about the particular details. I just need the general framework. Maybe that's geographic, maybe that's subject matter based. And then more recently, we had the concept getting a little more traction of these registries and their associated identifiers, where you're trying to have an impartial third party be the definer of the content in question that's being licensed, because that's really what we're talking about in any licensing transaction. We've got the parties involved, the content involved, and the rights that are being conveyed. So how does everybody agree on all of that? For a licensing agreement in the analog world, you're relying on things like an address of a company. That doesn't fly so hot. You know, people move. You need a better identifier than that. The content, as soon as somebody gets a file, first thing, I think I've renamed every single image in this presentation. So you can't go on a file name. You can make up some identifier, which often happens, but sometimes that gets lost in the process. So you register this thing with a third-party registry that's going to issue a globally unique and agreed upon identifier so that both parties know what piece of content it is we're talking about. So we've got a lot of different points points in metadata asset lifecycle where this kind of information gets added. Obviously, when we create a file, we get for free our physical or intrinsic metadata. But as we get into some more research on the topic, we may add some more information, add some things in the description. We may then go through maybe a more formalized cataloging process where we've got a restricted taxonomy. Then as we start to use that within the organization, collaborate on things, we might allow some more free-form tagging by general users that will make up anything they want. And then, of course, around when we actually publish it, we could add additional metadata there. And archiving the content in the end may also take on its own metadata. And the more informational metadata, again, about the abstract content that we can get up front, the better off we are. So if you go to, let's say, a product shoot where, in particular for the fashion industry, they'll often be shooting with the camera tethered to a computer. So they've got the photographer doing the shots, and they've got another person that's entering that metadata right as it's being shot, so right before it's ingested in the system. Things like who the designer was, the color, the size, all of these things that are going to be needed for something like a catalog, so they get it right up front. Another example is Major League Baseball. May not be too many baseball fans over here, but it's a good example because they've got 7 hours of video for every game hour. And so that includes, of course, the different angles, commentary, all that good stuff. And every shot is logged with who was in the shot, what was the play, how did that affect their statistics, all up front, right in the capture stage. So it's an impressive system. So why is all of this really all that important? What do we really need to do with this metadata? Mostly it's about making decisions, and people can make decisions. Maybe I don't actually want to download the gigabyte file if I'm on a legacy connection. Did anybody have one of these? 2, 3? Fun times. People can make decisions around copyright issues, right? They can investigate what, again, as we talked about, what rights were obtained. Hopefully we can get to a stage where we've got the machines helping to make some of that decision process, but a lot of the times now we're talking about human interaction, and at least providing them some of the information so that they can make their decisions, because as we said, it can get very complicated. And again, how much is it going to cost if we do want to use that? So, story about that is, had a local photographer that I've spoken to a couple of times, and he had an issue where, not local to here, sorry, local to me. He was shooting headshots, rather, for a local news reporter for the local news station. They were the person that hired this photographer, and did the shoot. She liked him very much. The station liked them very much. She went on to ESPN, which is a huge sports network, and she continued to use these headshots as her headshots. She had access to the files. They were, well, she didn't actually have rights to do that. They belonged to the station. There were no transfer rights. She didn't have rights to do that. So luckily that one was settled out of court. It wasn't too big of a deal. But there are a lot of issues to be conscious of here, and metadata can help in some of these cases. Obviously, our processes and workflows can make decisions. Maybe we don't publish an image to a website if it doesn't have a credit line embedded. We can do lots of different things with the metadata available. We can obviously organize and sort. You all are probably familiar with the categories and tags and share that allow you to focus on a subset of the content. It's a very powerful way to be able to narrow some of that stuff down. And then, of course, we can sort by various metadata standards as well. But probably the biggest thing is searching. And in particular, for visual content, we don't have full text. A Word doc, we can just parse the document. We can pull out all the text in there. We can search on that. We could feed that into these semantic engines and get all sorts of fun stuff back. But if we don't have this embedded informational metadata, we just can't find that stuff. We can't go by the file name. We absolutely must have that kind of thing in there. So an example, does anybody know what this is? Or I should say, what do you see when you look at this? I think it kind of looks like Ghost Rider. There's like a motorcycle guy, I can imagine. Anyone know what this is? The Rorschach test, psychological test, ink blot. What do you see here? Tells different characteristics about your personality and psyche, apparently. How do you spell Rorschach? Anyone know? I had no idea. I thought there was a W in it. Sometimes we might want to put in incorrect metadata just so people can find the thing. Does anybody know which blot number it is? Apparently, these are in a certain order that you're supposed to present to the patient to get the correct information. I wouldn't expect anybody. If somebody knows that, I'll buy you a beer later. No. Blot number 4, apparently. I don't know. I wouldn't know this stuff. So, of course, there is opportunities for some of this visual metadata to be in place for things like video in particular, and audio content, where we can have like closed captioning or transcription standards associated with it. So there is hope. We can do it for that stuff as well, and that's becoming more popular. And a picture's only worth 1,000 words if we can actually find it, right? Probably nobody here knows who this is. Anybody? Monica Lewinsky, very good. So Monica Lewinsky had an affair with US President Clinton, and this story broke, and it was huge, and she had been an intern for a while, 2 years since before that, and all of these organizations, news organizations, started frantically looking through all of their archives. We gotta find this. I'm sure we have this somewhere. Nobody could find it. But there was one photographer, Dirk Halstead, who knew that he took that photo. I've seen this woman before. This is 2 years later. And the way his workflow works is he's a Time magazine assignment photographer, and all of his pictures go to Time magazine first. They make their selects, and when they're done, they send it back to his agent. And then his agent makes their selects for giving to other clients, possibly for other licensing purposes. And then all of those come back to Dirk again, and every year and a half or so, he gets around to archiving those to the University of Texas. And again, he knew that he had shot this, so he employed the best facial recognition system on the planet, a single researcher who sat in a basement for 4 days looking through 5,000 slides, and she found one image, this image here, which ended up being worth a decent amount of money because it was one of the first shots of them together. Now, getting back to metadata, this would be unlikely to have been tagged with Monica Lewinsky, but maybe we would have an attendee list of the event that we could associate with every image in there. And at least we could narrow it down from 5,000 to maybe a couple of hundred, if less. Anybody know what this building is? Yes, NSA, National Security Agency of US. What does that have to do with it? Well, the recent hubbub, at least the beginning of the recent hubbub, was all about the metadata of phone calls. It wasn't about the phone calls themselves. It wasn't about the conversation or a transcript. It was about who called who and when. So obviously, we can do all sorts of crazy analysis on just the metadata itself. And as I was preparing these slides, a few cars showed up outside of my house. Why was I searching for all these pictures of NSA? Because this is about 15 minutes down the street from me. We can do integrations and interactions with other organizations. And yes, we got to get back to the standards again. We've always got to use these standards for that kind of stuff to happen. For these systems to talk to each other and know what that data model is, and for organizations communicating with each other and trying to determine what that data is, we've got to use these standards. And one option there is embedding some of this stuff in your content before it leaves the organization. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And again, we can use these globally unique identifiers so that both parties or systems can identify what this thing is. And of course, these external registries that I mentioned. And again, these concepts are not new. This stuff has been around for quite a while. We had these slides, and they had this mount on the outside that contained all kinds of useful information. On this one, I'm not sure if you could see it, but it's at the bottom, we've got a credit line. At the top, we've got information that this was a meteorite. Now, otherwise, this is a pretty boring picture of a car that's knocked up a little bit. But this was actually hit by a meteorite. That's pretty cool. It's got some dates on there. It's got some other cataloging information. And in a previous life, I did some systems integration work with some of the scanning side of things. And we had this scanner. It was cool for its day. It's a glass plate slide scanner, and it's actually a fixed sensor. So the whole plate comes out of the side there and would knock people's coffee into keyboards. It's pretty funny. You'd always put a note up there, but somebody would always do it. And you had these trays that you would stick the slides in. And I remember creating these scripts that would make 2 passes. We would do a transmissive pass for the content itself, the picture of the car. And then we'd do a reflective pass just to grab that metadata. And then we would slap them together, stick them together, because we knew, of course, from the slide holder exactly where that should be lined up. So it was that valuable. We needed to capture that stuff right on digitization. So those of you working with archive projects, this is definitely something to consider. Don't lose that valuable information that's on those slide mounts. Some of us used to write on Polaroids. You'd write on the bottom, this is Jack and Diane, and flip it over on the back, and they're eating a chili dog outside of the Tasty Freeze, of course. And there's lots of sites and places that are emulating this now. This was actually a digital picture that I shot, and there's sites out there that you feed in your image and it makes it look like it was a Polaroid. There's even sites and phone apps to take your pictures and actually print them out onto Polaroid film so that you can mail them to people. Crazy. This stuff started a long time ago in a galaxy far away. So here we've got embedded metadata right in this film. This is a digital slate that's telling us the film, the scene, sometimes who's in it, the take number, of course, right? Embedded analog metadata. How about this one? Anybody know who that is? Very good, Bill Gates. Here we see it again, embedded analog metadata. Right there, we've got the information we need. How about this one? Anybody? This is fun. These poor guys picking on them. All right, does this help? Same guy, unfortunately. Time was not good to him. Nick Nolte. All right, but enough about all that. What's new in 4.2? You guys got through the metadata overview. Woo. So for a refresher, we've got the concept of these mapping metadata classes, where we've got a library or command line that is producing its metadata in the language that it's going to call it, its data model. And then we have a mapping file, properties file, that's going to take that library metadata and map it to our Alfresco data model. And if your name is on the slide and you're paying attention, stand up quickly. Nick Birch. So at the bottom, we've got the actual mappings in place from, again, on the left-hand side, we've got our libraries metadata. And on the right-hand side, we've got our Alfresco data model. And then we're defining the namespaces there at the top. Nothing new there, just a refresher of how all that works. Now, in the past, that properties file that defined that mapping was buried into the repository jar under the same package as the Java classes that were using them. So now, that stuff is pulled out and it's directly in config under Alfresco/metadata, similar to Alfresco/model, right there in config, so you can get at the cookies quickly. But don't actually do that. at least not in production. It's very useful for developers to get in there and change something really quickly and see how it's going to behave, but you really need to be customizing things properly using techniques like AMPs so that your upgrades are upgrade safe, and it'll be a big headache if you strictly rely on doing it that way, but it's very helpful for development. Related to that was this property of inheritDefaultMapping. So if I were trying to extend a mapping metadata extractor, I would have the ability to say I want to just inherit the defaults and I want to make some changes to it. So in the past, that was merging each of the individual ones that were defined, which made it difficult to override a single property. If I want to replace it, not add to it, I just want to replace it, you'd have to redefine the entire file just to get that one property. So now those individual entries are replaced. So what that results in is your customization file, your override, can contain, just that single line that you're trying to override. And if you want to include the original properties, you can, of course, just define it as such. Some metadata extractors can misbehave a little bit. Sometimes they can consume resources, hold up other processes. So we've added timeouts to that. And we've done that through metadata extractor limits. So this follows the precedence for the content transformers, very similar. But currently, the only thing in there is a timeout specification. And the way that works is that we wrap the actual call to the extraction in this extract raw callable, which implements Java's callable class. And we send that off to a future task, a Java future task, or we create, rather, a Java future task, and send that off to an executor service, which then can obey any timeout that we specify. This is cool stuff. I really like this stuff. And that is defined as the standard repository properties property, and the default timeout is 20 seconds. So if you need that longer, shorter, it's easy to go in and tweak that timeout. So we talked about those tags and organization. And we talked about standards, which is how our different clients can use the same metadata. So why can't we take advantage of that? Well, we can. We've got now metadata tag mapping, where we can go from any kind of multi-valued property into a taggable property, which allows us to use those tags that we saw in Alfresco Share, which again are incredibly powerful for narrowing down your subsets of content. Now this is disabled intentionally by default. This is how you can enable it, and there's links in the slides that you can see more of this information. And hopefully we'll get to a demo of some of this as well. Now, in almost every organization, your content is going to have to leave at some point. That can be a bit like sending your child off to kindergarten, which I've had to do recently. It's a bit like the first day and you're worried about your little content ending up in the right place and people talking nicely to it, and you might pin a note to its shirt, right? That's analog metadata back in play. And we have some of the same concepts with files. We can embed metadata. We message in a bottle kind of thing. We can put that stuff back in there. That's how we got it most of the time, the informational metadata. Somebody's put it in there. So we've got that concept now in Alfresco of embedding metadata through this metadata embedder interface, which is essentially the reverse of the concepts around the extractors. So we have an embed method that takes our data model properties. We're given the original source file, and we're given a target writer of where we want to put the result. So our abstract mapping metadata extractor, rather than having duplicates of every single class, one for extractor, one for embedding, we've rolled that in, and there's support for that. There's implementation of that interface. So there's an embed internal, just like extract internal. And that mapping is assumed to be the reverse of the extraction mapping, but you can specify an override. So if you do a .embed on your property's name, it will take that as the embedding mapping. Maybe there's only a few properties that you want to try to embed. So you can explicitly say, these are the ones I want in my embed mapping. Tika has a concept of metadata embedding. This is a little bit of how it looks. You're sending metadata along with the file, similar to our embed method that we just saw. Tika's doing the work of putting that into the file, bringing back the result. which we can, of course, ingest as our result. So our Tika-powered metadata extractor calls a Tika embedder's embed method. That's the override implementation of this embed internal class and abstract mapping metadata. Now, I should make a note that currently, embed internal in the abstract mapping metadata is not an abstract class. So if you're extending it, you do not have to implement this method. It's currently an implemented method that does nothing in the abstract base class. In the future, it'll probably be an abstract so that we can guarantee that sort of thing. And then, of course, we need to trigger this stuff. So we've got a content metadata embedder, which is an action executor. It'll show up as I want to embed properties as metadata in my content. Hopefully, that's a good explanation of what it does. And some caveats to all this is that we don't actually supply any embedders out of the box. And there's some reasons for that. But some of the underlying libraries do support it. As we said, Tika has a concept of it. Poi has the certain methods for, as I recall, certain methods for embedding. But we can also do things like wrap command line tools. So Tika EXIF tool is a project which is meant to wrap this command line tool of EXIF tool. If you're not familiar with it, it works on many different platforms. It extracts and embeds many different types of metadata into many different file formats. So we can wrap that command line tool, and that gives us that Tika parser and Tika embedder, so we can do it that way. End result is that we can create a rule, we can edit properties in share, just like any other property, create a rule specifying that on update content, I want to trigger this embed process, edit our properties, click save, and then when we send that file off, it's got that metadata embedded. So our binary storage, we haven't talked a whole lot about exactly how this stuff is stored in the file, particularly our informational metadata. And back to our analogy of the message in a bottle, there's lots of different file formats, and there's lots of different metadata types that can be stored lots of different ways, different serializations, different expressions. But there is one solution to that is XMP, which is trying to standardize that container and standardize the way in which that metadata is expressed, at least. Here's a look at some raw XMP. Again, don't expect you to see that. Within that, we have, very similar to our mapping stuff, we've got namespaces at the top, which are defining more precisely what the metadata is we're talking about. We've got the values, of course, at the bottom. So here we see a title, which is a localized property, and we see DC subject, our keywords that we've been talking about. Now, you really, again, should be using standards wherever you can, but if there's absolutely no standard that fits the metadata you're trying to express, you can use custom metadata, and XMP will actually do a decent job at that, because it's very extensible. So Tika does some of this already, a lot of the parsing already of different XMP values through its various libraries that it's drawing upon. And of course, we talked about the Tika EXIF tool, but there's also work being done on a pure XMP metadata extractor, which will read those XMP packets from a file and then uses Java XMP parsers, which draw upon Adobe's XMP core Java library to do that processing. And this becomes useful for more complex metadata schemas that you need to map to the Alfresco data model properties. So that works by, again, you define the XMP parsers available for the metadata extractor, and each of those is responsible for a particular metadata standard, like Dublin Core. And so it'll just iterate through all of those and then do that mapping to, again, the Alfresco data model. So again, our metadata is powerful or awesome. Metadata is not new. We don't want to lose any lessons that we've learned in the past around the analog stuff. So be sure you're thinking about that, especially if you're doing some kind of archival project. And of course, we strive to make it easy for you all to deal with metadata. So we have just a few minutes, and I can try to get through this demo where we'll see this tag mapping, embedding, and custom XMP. Speed demo. All right, Apple preview. I'm just going to open our inspector. I'm going to add a few keywords here. Water. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a, you guys can't see my screen at all, can you? There we go. All right. So there's actually a dog, a crazy dog sitting in the middle of that. I don't want that one in there. All right, so we'll save that. Now I have too many windows open. And we'll drag this into share. And we can see we've got water, dog, marked as tags right there. We can do embed. So here I've got that rule set up. If, well, we can take a quick look at that rule. When items are updated, if the type is content, perform that action. Embed properties as metadata in content. Simple enough. So let's bring this guy in here. Cross our fingers for the demo gods. Summon embed. And that was, if you saw that scroll by, that was all the IPTC properties coming from a module that I have installed. Let's open this guy. Download this guy, because we need the embedded version. And we're going to open that in, as we talked about, Photoshop's file info. Hopefully. We don't want our raw XMP. The mapping that I have set up is, again, just the reverse of the extract. So that went into our description field. And let's make this a little bit smaller. Let's take this guy. And what I have installed in this version of Photoshop is Adobe's generic example of how to extend your file info panels with custom metadata. I haven't changed it at all. I just dropped in the generic stuff. And what I do have in the mapping, which I can show you in a second. All right, so we will save that. So here is that custom metadata mapping. XMP custom happens to be the prefix that Adobe uses in there. And we can see up here that mapping to taggable. We're taking Dublin Core subject, mapping that to taggable. And here's where we got that reverse mapping for our embed. So we have saved that file. Let's go back over here, bring that in, share. And hopefully, since we saw that custom was mapped to title, if we grab, now I can't see it, that one, we should see, my custom field. There we go. That may be the fastest demo so far. All right, thanks for coming. Any questions? Yes.
What's next?
What's next? That's a great question. Is our counsel in the room? Yeah. As you saw, working on the pure XMP stuff, I think we're going to see a lot more around the XMP. Working on more support for embedders and out-of-the-box embedders for common use cases. I mentioned that the things like tagging, it doesn't need to be improved so much, but the use case is examined. And that's the reason it's off by default is, for example, certain stock houses, when you're purchasing imagery, they might have 100 keywords in there. And if you have an organization that likes to restrict the vocabulary and taxonomy used for tags, if you prefer not to have free-form tagging in your organization, well, that's going to mess up your whole business there. So you don't want that automatically coming into play. So I think that in the long term, there's also work on essentially better support for structured metadata rather than just the flat property mapping. Hopefully that answers your question. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thank you.